Racist officer hits black agent. Seconds later, he's surrounded by federal cars. The sun beat down on the cracked sidewalks of Somerset, Georgia, a quiet town where the silence wasn't peaceful but heavy, like something waiting to be broken. It was just past noon when Officer Brent Halver pulled his squad car into a wide turn along Maple Avenue, his sunglasses hiding a gaze always scanning for what didn't belong. To Brent, what didn't belong was often just a feeling, a gut reaction that required no backup, no probable cause, just a badge and enough silence to act without question. On that particular afternoon, traffic was light. A few mothers pushed strollers under the oppressive southern heat, and a boy on a skateboard shot past the corner deli. But Brent's focus locked on a black woman crossing near the intersection, moving with deliberate calm. She wore a fitted navy windbreaker over a gray tee, slim black jeans, and carried a nondescript brown leather satchel. No rush, no visible reason to be noticed. And yet that alone was what set something off in Brent. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look defiant. She just didn't look like someone trying to stay small. He flicked the lights on. The squad car jerked up onto the curb, tires bumping the concrete with a sharp jolt. A few pedestrians stopped. A barista inside the cafe by the corner window paused mid-pour. But nobody moved, because everyone in that part of town had learned something. When Brent Halver stepped out of his car with a straight back and a clenched jaw, it was best to stay quiet and watch. "Ma'am!" Brent barked, voice echoing off the brick storefronts. "Stop right there." The woman paused. She turned slowly, one eyebrow barely raised, and looked directly at him. "You got some ID?" Brent asked, already moving toward her, his boots heavy on the sidewalk. She didn't reach for anything. Instead, she said with a voice soft and clear, "Is there a reason you're stopping me, officer?" That sentence, calm, restrained, only tightened the coil inside him. He didn't like being questioned, and he certainly didn't like being questioned by someone who didn't lower their eyes when he stepped into their space. Brent stepped closer, breathing heavier now, more out of instinct than reason. "You match a description," he said curtly, although there had been no call, no alert. He was making it up, and he didn't care. "What description?" she asked, not moving, not flinching. "The kind that doesn't ask questions when I say stop." That was when he reached out and shoved her shoulder. Not hard, but enough to test a boundary. She didn't move back. Didn't react. He felt the heat rise in his chest, his vision narrowing with the old familiar rush he'd never admit to. And then he did it. A sharp right hook caught her jaw. The sound was sickening, a wet, cracking slap of skin against skin that echoed across the street. The woman staggered, but didn't fall. Blood dripped from the corner of her mouth. Her hands never rose in defense. She simply looked up at him with an expression that made him, just for a moment, take half a step back. "What the hell, man?" someone yelled from across the street. A teenager pulled out a phone. Others had stopped, some stunned into silence, others filming. The moment was no longer his. "Step back," Brent snapped, turning toward the growing cluster of witnesses. "This is an active stop." But the woman was still standing. Still, not saying a word, and then something shifted. It started with a sound, a low, rising hum of tires on pavement. 3 black SUVs rounded the corner, unmarked but unmistakable in their precision. The type of vehicles you only saw in movies or nightmares. They didn't screech to a halt, they didn't blare sirens, they just surrounded the block with a quiet authority that needed no introduction. Doors opened in perfect unison. Men and women in suits stepped out. Some wore sunglasses. Some didn't. One of them, a tall, graying man in a slate suit, walked directly toward the woman without sparing Brent a glance. "Agent Monroe," the man said softly, like addressing an old friend. She nodded once. Then, to everyone's confusion, she took out a small ID from a hidden flap inside her satchel and handed it to him. The man turned, looked straight at Brent. "You just assaulted a federal agent." Brent's mouth went dry. He opened it to speak, but nothing came out. Two others approached him, calmly, methodically. "We need your weapon and badge," one said. "This is—" "Wait, I didn't know." "No one said you did," the older man replied. "But that's not going to matter now." The crowd grew thicker, phones in hand, disbelief in their faces. Brent looked around, searching for an ally, a reason, a way out. But all he saw were eyes, eyes that had seen what he'd done, eyes that were now watching him shrink in real time. "I need to call my chief," Brent said, his voice cracking. "He's already been notified," the agent said without looking at him, "along with Internal Affairs and the Department of Justice." And just like that, Brent Halver realized something he'd never believed before. There were places where his badge couldn't protect him, rooms he couldn't enter, doors that were closed not because of race or rank, but because he had crossed a line so deep, so old, and so watched that retribution didn't even raise its voice. Agent Monroe turned to look at him one last time. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any handcuff, and as she stepped into the black SUV, the crowd parted. Brent stood frozen on the sidewalk, cuffed by men who didn't shout, watched by a community that didn't need to speak. Because justice didn't come with sirens that day, it came in quiet black cars and a silence that made every bystander exhale, and deep down, Brent knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the system he thought he owned, and the woman who just showed him how wrong he was. Brent Halver sat in a windowless room at the Somerset County Station, arms crossed, the skin around his knuckles raw from his own tightening grip. His patrol uniform, which had once made him feel untouchable, now clung to him like a shrinking skin. The room wasn't an interrogation chamber, just a plain administrative office repurposed in a hurry, as if the department itself was trying to hide him somewhere no one would look. Outside the door, muffled voices rose and fell. Phone calls, rushed footsteps, the shuffle of decision-makers who weren't used to being this afraid. But Brent wasn't afraid, not yet. He was angry. Furious, confused. "She didn't say who she was," he muttered under his breath again and again, as if repeating it could change something. "No ID, no badge, nothing." The door opened. Captain Reynolds stepped in, tall, with a face drawn tight like leather that had seen too many storms. Behind him, a younger officer named Mendoza entered, tablet in hand. Reynolds didn't sit. "She's CIA, Brent," Reynolds said flatly. Brent blinked. "That's not possible." She's not just any agent. She's a classified asset, Tier 1. Her identity wasn't even in our system." Brent stared at the captain, willing him to be joking. "So what? I hit some spook who forgot to wear a vest." "I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," Mendoza cut in, his voice a little too sharp. "You acted like you didn't need to know. You escalated a non-incident, no probable cause, no report. Just instinct. That's not protocol." Brent scoffed, rubbing his jaw with the back of his hand. "I've pulled over dozens of people like her. No ID, walking like they own the place." Reynolds leaned in, lowering his voice. "This wasn't just someone you pulled over, Brent. This wasn't a street hassle. This was a federal-level operative who's now triggered a full-scale interagency audit of our department. Do you understand what that means?" For the first time, Brent didn't have a comeback. Something in Reynolds's eyes, something brittle, told him this was bigger than he could bluff through. "Where is she now?" Brent asked. Reynolds paused, measuring whether the question was worth answering. She's gone. She was picked up. Black SUV, no trace, not our jurisdiction anymore. Not even local FBI. They sent someone from Langley. Brent's chest tightened. So that's it. I'm being hung out to dry? Mendoza tilted the tablet so Brent could see. It was a screenshot, a still frame from the moment the punch landed, frozen in time. Blood just beginning to bead on her lip, a crowd in the background watching. The image wasn't blurry. It was crisp, brutal. Raw. This photo's already leaked, Mendoza said. It's trending. Over 2 million views in 3 hours. You're not just suspended, you're viral. Brent swallowed hard. Reynolds sat down finally, folding his hands. You're going on leave, effective immediately. Unpaid. DOJ is requesting a transcript of every stop you've made in the past 5 years. Civilian review boards getting involved. There's going to be media pressure, state pressure, and federal heat you've never experienced. Brent's face turned red. You're throwing me under the bus. No, Reynolds said calmly. You jumped in front of it. Brent stood up so fast the chair scraped backward against the linoleum. This is crap. I was doing my job. She didn't look right. She was too calm, too composed. Reynolds' voice grew cold. You don't get to assault someone because they look too calm. That's not a threat. That's someone who didn't flinch when you pulled out your authority. Outside the room, a new voice echoed down the hallway. A woman, clipped, professional. Somerset PD internal logs and surveillance backups, please. We need a secure copy of everything starting 12 hours before the incident. Brent looked toward the door. Who's that? Mendoza glanced toward the hall. Federal Internal Affairs, they're scanning your body cam. You know what they'll find? Brent didn't answer. No audio warning, no reasonable suspicion stated, no de-escalation. Just a punch, on record. Brent's fists curled. I'm telling you, she provoked me. Mendoza's eyes narrowed. Did she speak to you before the hit? Silence. Brent looked away, and then something else buzzed inside the room. Reynolds's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at it. His brows lifted, surprised. They want you to stay put. Don't leave town. What? Am I being arrested? Reynolds stood again, no longer hiding the gravity in his posture. Not yet, but you're under federal review. They're not pressing charges yet. But they've frozen your access to all systems, including pension, case logs, and firearms license. You'll be contacted by a federal review board. Brent didn't understand how it unraveled so quickly. In the span of a few hours, he had gone from patrol king of Somerset to the department's ticking time bomb. He stormed out of the room, ignoring Mendoza's warnings, headed for the parking lot. His keys felt sharp in his pocket, like they didn't belong to him anymore. The lot was mostly empty, but parked just across from his personal truck, a black SUV idled. He froze. The window rolled down halfway. A woman in a dark suit sat in the driver's seat. No expression, just a slow, deliberate nod in his direction. Brent stepped back unconsciously. Another SUV turned the corner and slowed. It wasn't following him. It wasn't even threatening. But the message was clear. You're being watched. Brent's mouth was dry as ash. At home that night, the doorbell rang. He jerked, startled. When he opened the door, there was no one there, just a small envelope on the ground. Inside, a printed photo, that same frame, him striking Monroe. On the back, one sentence in block letters. You only had to ask who she was. His breath caught. No signature, no threat. But the intent pierced deeper than anything legal. Across town, Monroe sat at a long wooden table in a quiet, windowless briefing room. She didn't speak. She didn't review files. She simply waited while the men around her reviewed the events. You didn't respond, one man in a black suit said, tapping his pen. Why? She finally looked up. because the system responded for me. And that was the moment they realized something chilling. She never needed to lift a hand. All she had to do was let him expose himself, and then walk away. The next morning, the city of Somerset was wide awake, but Brent Halver felt like he was walking in a dream where everything had turned against him. He stepped into his favorite diner, Frankie's, where he'd eaten breakfast nearly every shift for a decade. Normally, the bell above the door would trigger a warm, "Morning, Officer Halver," from the hostess. Not today. Today, silence hit harder than any shout. A few customers looked up, made brief eye contact, and looked away. No smiles, no nods. He walked up to the counter and waited for Carol, the owner, to come out from the back. She finally did, apron on, towel in hand. She paused when she saw him. Her lips pressed into a flat line. "Hey, Carol," Brent said, trying for casual. "Just my usual." Carol didn't move. "It'd be better if you didn't eat here today." Brent's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me? You're on every screen in this city. I got parents with their kids in here. I can't have a scene. Not today." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. She wasn't hostile. She wasn't cruel, but she was clear. The trust he once carried like a badge had been revoked, not by a court, but by the people who once greeted him with familiarity. He backed away slowly and left. Outside, parked across the street, was another black SUV. Different plates this time. He stared at it long and hard, trying to see the silhouette inside, but the windows were tinted too dark. Whoever it was, they didn't move. Back in his apartment, Brent turned on the TV, hoping for distraction. But every channel, local, national, even sports news, ran segments about the Somerset incident. They didn't say his name outright, but the image of his punch, frozen midair, now carried commentary from retired officers, legal experts, even former intelligence analysts. "They're saying she never fought back," one anchor said. "That the calmness of her reaction is what made the video go viral. What kind of person gets punched and doesn't flinch?" Another guest replied, "The kind that's trained to dismantle empires with a whisper." Brent hurled the remote across the room. It bounced off the wall and hit the floor. Later that afternoon, he received a call from someone he hadn't spoken to in years. His father, retired sheriff from a neighboring town, once proud to wear the badge, now quiet. "Brent," the old man said, his voice like gravel, "whatever you did, son, it's already bigger than you." "I didn't know who she was, Dad." "That's not the point. The point is the way you acted. It's all out there now. You've been that guy before. This time people saw it. I didn't mean to. I'm not the one you need to explain it to." The line went dead. Across town, in the basement of an anonymous government building, a meeting convened. No phones, no recordings, just 11 people in suits sitting around a table with soundproof walls. On the screen in front of them, the same still image from the video was paused. Alyssa Monroe just after the punch, her head turned slightly, her expression unreadable. "This is her?" asked Director Vaughn from Federal Oversight. "She was part of the Phoenix Black program," replied a woman with silver hair tied tightly back. "Operational for 8 years, deep embed. Psychological reconnaissance." "Why is she in Somerset?" "She's off-grid, voluntary disengagement. We thought she was in Buenos Aires under an alias." Clearly we were wrong. A young analyst at the table looked confused. Why didn't she retaliate? The woman gave a faint smile. Because she didn't need to. The system did exactly what she wanted it to do the moment she stood still. Back in Somerset, Brent was called in to sign his formal suspension paperwork. The station was ice cold with judgment. Even officers he once mentored avoided his eyes. Someone had taken his name off the duty roster entirely. Handwritten in sharp black ink, a single line struck through. As he walked down the hallway to the admin office, he passed the record room. A woman named Kira, who worked digital surveillance, stood in the doorway watching him. Brent had always brushed her off before, too quiet, too smart, but now she looked at him differently. "You know why they froze your access?" she asked quietly. Brent hesitated. "Because of the investigation." She shook her head. "No. Because they're scanning your body cam logs, not just from that day, from every day." His mouth went dry. "They're looking for a pattern. They think this wasn't the first time you snapped." "You think I'm the only one?" he said bitterly. "No," Kira replied. "But you were the one caught on camera hitting a woman who didn't hit back. And now she's turned that silence into a mirror." Brent stared at her. "What does that mean?" Kira didn't answer. She just stepped inside and closed the door. That night, he couldn't sleep. The hallway outside his apartment echoed with every passing footstep, every creak. He stared at the ceiling, heart racing. His phone buzzed at 2:17 a.m. Unknown number. No message, then a second later an email, subject, "No one asked you to hit her." No body text, just a video attachment. He opened it. It wasn't the viral video, it was new, body cam footage from his own device. But the view was different, almost like it had been filtered through another lens. It showed Monroe's face, her gaze locking with his just before he swung, paused. Reversed, paused again. Then a single frame held just long enough to make his stomach turn. Her eyes weren't just calm, they were watching, calculating, and in that moment even Brent knew the truth. She let it happen, not because she was weak, because she wanted everyone to see exactly what he would do when he thought no one important was watching. And now, everyone was. The day after the footage leaked, everything in Somerset felt just a little quieter. Not because the city was calm, but because people were holding their breath. News outlets had stopped speculating. They were waiting. Something was moving beneath the surface, and it wasn't public opinion. Brent Halver sat alone in his apartment, half lit by the television's blue glow. He hadn't shaved. He hadn't changed clothes. His eyes were locked on the news ticker running at the bottom of the screen. Sources confirm former CIA behavioral operative Alyssa Monroe was the woman assaulted in the viral Somerset video. He turned off the TV. The phone rang again. Unknown caller. He let it ring. He thought about Alyssa's face in that frame. Calm, focused. Not broken, not even surprised. And now that he knew who she was, or at least what she'd once been, the silence of her reaction no longer felt like restraint. It felt like calculation. He picked up his phone and called the precinct. "Detective Gates," the voice on the other end said. Gates had been his closest friend on the force. For years they'd worked patrol, shared drinks, defended each other in front of internal review boards. "Hey, it's me," Brent said, voice low. There was a long pause. "I can't talk to you," Gates replied. "We're in the middle of a federal audit." "A what?" "Every file you ever touched. Every stop, every arrest. Brent, they've frozen your badge ID and the entire system." "That's never happened before." Brent's throat tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I don't think I can help you anymore." The line went dead. He dropped the phone and leaned forward, elbows on knees, sweat beating at his temples. He didn't even hear the knock at the door. It came again, harder this time. Brent stood cautiously, checked the peephole. Two men in black suits, no local PD insignia, no obvious agency tags. Just the kind of people who don't need to identify themselves. He cracked the door slightly. "Brent Halver?" Yes. Please step outside. He hesitated. What's this about? We're not here to arrest you, one of them said. But if you don't come with us, someone else will, and it won't be this polite. Brent stepped out, heart hammering, and followed them into a black SUV. No sirens, no handcuffs, but the tension in the vehicle was suffocating. They drove without speaking until they reached a government facility on the outskirts of town, one Brent didn't even know existed. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed quietly. The walls were bare concrete. No signs, no windows. They brought him to a small room where a woman sat already, tablet in hand. Early 50s, sharp gaze, not FBI. Not DHS, something else. Mr. Halver, sit, she said. Do you know who I am? He shook his head. I work with a multi-agency review team under National Intelligence Oversight. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that you're not under arrest. Then why am I here? Because you struck someone the system can't afford to antagonize. Brent's eyes narrowed. I didn't know who she was. Exactly, she said. And that ignorance is what makes you dangerous. You didn't abuse power knowingly. You abused it reflexively. He looked away. The woman continued, voice clipped and precise. We've spent 2 decades trying to manage the public's trust in federal agencies, and in 30 seconds you almost undid half that work. It was one mistake. It was 100, she snapped, eyes flaring. But this one was caught, and not just caught, weaponized. Do you understand what she's doing? Brent swallowed hard. She's not saying anything. Exactly. And that silence has now triggered congressional inquiries, social mobilization, and internal restructuring inside 3 federal departments. All because you threw a punch. He leaned forward, desperate. So what do you want from me? An apology? A press tour? The woman laughed quietly. No, Officer Halver, we're past that. You're not the story anymore. Then why am I here? To tell you the truth, she said. You weren't the only one being watched that day. Brent's brow furrowed. She tapped her tablet. The screen flickered to life and showed a second angle of the event. Not a body cam, not a bystander video, but a feed from a satellite drone. High resolution, tight on both faces, audio enhanced. You weren't just caught. You were baited. Brent stared at the screen, slack-jawed. What? She walked that street because she wanted someone to react, to provoke. Not for revenge, for exposure. You're saying she set me up? No, I'm saying she set the system up. You were just the piece that moved first. Brent leaned back, pale. Why? The woman stood and walked slowly around the table, her voice low. Because she once served a system that taught her how to dismantle minds without weapons. And then she realized the system itself needed dismantling. Brent stared down at his trembling hands. So what happens to me? She didn't answer, just looked at him for a long moment, then said, You'll find out, but the world you knew, it's gone. As he was escorted back to the SUV, Brent felt something strange. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was the crushing weight of knowing he was no longer relevant. And back in the quiet corners of Somerset, Alyssa sat with a group of children at the community center, helping a little boy with his signing. She didn't speak of what had happened. She didn't explain where she'd been, but when one of the children looked up and asked, Miss Alyssa, why do people look at you like that now? She only smiled and signed back. Because sometimes truth doesn't need to speak, it just needs to stand where everyone can see it. 2 weeks after the incident, a ripple of discomfort spread through the Somerset Police Department like a cold draft through a cracked window. Nobody said her name. Nobody had to. Her presence echoed in the gaps of every hallway conversation, in the nervous shifts of officers avoiding eye contact at morning briefings, and in the fact that Brent Halver's name had quietly vanished from all internal communications. One day he was just gone. No ceremony, no announcement. Just silence. Inside the Internal Affairs Division, a file labeled Monroe Incident lay open on the desk of Deputy Chief Darlene Frost. She stared at the photographs clipped inside, still shots from the altercation, Alyssa's unflinching expression, Brent's raised arm. On another page, a printed quote from the first eyewitness who spoke up. She didn't hit back. She just stared at him like she was watching him collapse in slow motion. Frost leaned back in her chair and sighed. She'd survived citywide corruption probes, diffused protests, buried more than a few ugly departmental truths. But nothing had prepared her for this. You couldn't bury someone who didn't speak. You couldn't twist the words of someone who refused to give them. And you certainly couldn't threaten a woman who had already walked away from power once. She picked up the phone and dialed an encrypted line. "Special Agent Keene," came the voice on the other end. "She's not going to sue," Frost said flatly. "I didn't think she would." "Then what the hell is she doing?" There was a pause. "She's waiting." "For what?" "For everyone else to catch up." Frost rubbed her temples. "You need to understand something. This department, it's starting to unravel. Cops are scared. Community groups are pulling out of partnerships. Donors are freezing their funding. The mayor's office is demanding answers. And all because of one woman who won't even speak to a reporter. And that should tell you something," Keene replied. "This isn't a media storm. It's a reckoning." At that same hour, across the city in a glass conference room at the district attorney's office, Assistant DA Margot Ruiz stared at a list of names compiled by her junior investigator. At the top, Brent Halver. Beneath it, 7 other officers, all previously cleared in use-of-force reviews now being re-examined because witnesses had started coming forward after the footage broke. Ruiz tapped her pen against her legal pad. "You're telling me none of these people were willing to speak until now?" The investigator, a young woman named Cheryl, nodded. "They said they didn't think anyone would listen. But when they saw what happened to Alyssa and how she just stood there, they realized silence isn't safety." Ruiz's gaze hardened. "Get me everything. Files, depositions. Video. I want full timelines and start prepping the warrants. We're going to reopen every one of these cases." Meanwhile, in the halls of federal law enforcement, the name Monroe was now being passed between departments like a live wire. Not as a threat, not as a rogue agent, but as a force that exposed the fragile shell of every institution that claimed to stand for justice. At Homeland Security, analysts dissected her behavior. At Justice, career prosecutors argued over the legal precedent her silence was setting. And at Quantico, an ethics training seminar had just added a new case study, the power of unacknowledged authority. At the community center, Alyssa was back to routine. Painting with the kids, teaching ASL through song lyrics, helping an elderly volunteer organize supply closets. But each time she stepped outside the building, she noticed the shift. People didn't just nod at her. They paused. They watched. They tried to reconcile the quiet woman in jeans and sneakers with the image that had now defined a national conversation. One afternoon, a group of teens from a local high school approached her, nervous, unsure. One of them, a girl with a lanyard around her neck and anxiety written across her face, stepped forward. "I'm sorry, but are you her?" Alyssa tilted her head. "Her who?" "The one from the video." Alyssa didn't answer. She simply waited. The girl blurted, "We're doing a school project on justice, and no one teaches this. Not the way you did." Alyssa smiled gently. "What are you trying to learn?" "How to speak up." She paused. "Then maybe don't start with words. Start with paying attention. Then ask yourself what silence is hiding." The students stood frozen for a second before the girl whispered, "Thank you," and they walked away quietly, as if trying not to disturb the weight of what had just passed. That evening, in a mid-level office building off Capitol Hill, two congresswomen, one progressive, one conservative, met in a private session to discuss the ripple effect of the Monroe moment. A leaked memo on Alyssa's former classification status had made its way to several advocacy groups. They demanded reform. Transparency. A public apology. "I don't think we can make this go away," said Representative Lawson, pushing her glasses up her nose. "We shouldn't try," replied Representative Martin. "It's not a scandal, it's a mirror. She's not even asking for change." "No," Martin said, her voice low. "But she's forcing it." And far away, in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, Alyssa sat at her kitchen table. The lights were off, the window open. The hum of distant traffic floated in. Her phone buzzed once. A text. From an unknown number, it read, "They're scrambling, and they still don't understand. You've already changed more by saying nothing than most of us ever did shouting." Alyssa stared at the message, then typed a reply. "I'm not trying to change them." She hesitated, then added, "I'm showing them what they already knew and chose to forget." Then she put the phone down, and just like that, a chapter closed, not with a statement, not with an explosion, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that the most powerful truths are the ones that leave no room for denial. The federal building in D.C. that handled internal investigations wasn't flashy. Gray exterior, sterile hallways, elevators that hummed too long between floors. But that Tuesday morning, one of its smallest conference rooms was unusually crowded, not with press, not with protesters, with auditors, internal affairs. DOJ Ethics Counsel, a representative from the Office of Civil Rights, and sitting alone at the center of the rectangular table wearing a simple black blouse and navy slacks was Alyssa Monroe. She had been invited, not summoned, and she hadn't responded for days, but now she was here. The door clicked shut behind her. Silence spread like fog. A man cleared his throat. Deputy Director Ernest Colton, a career official who had spent 3 decades navigating scandals, oversight panels, and more than a few classified disasters. But this wasn't a PR mess. This was something deeper. Something they couldn't contain because it had already happened without them. Colton leaned forward, voice slow. "Ms. Monroe, we appreciate you coming." Alyssa didn't reply. "We're not here to accuse. This is an informal review." "To understand." She looked around the room. The faces staring at her weren't angry. They were confused. Even afraid not of her, but of what she had unlocked. A woman to Colton's right, Eleanor Branch from DOJ Ethics, finally spoke. "Why didn't you come forward sooner, after the assault, after the video?" "You had every legal avenue to take him down, and yet—" Alyssa's eyes didn't move from Eleanor's face. "I didn't need to." "You don't think justice matters?" Eleanor asked. Alyssa spoke softly. "I think justice is too often confused with vengeance." One of the analysts, younger, jittery, interjected, "But people are reacting to you because they think you represent something, a reckoning, a stand against abuse." Alyssa tilted her head slightly. And what does that say about the system if a stand is defined by not reacting? Colton shifted in his seat, now visibly unsettled. There are things at stake here. The department is unraveling. Public confidence, Alyssa interrupted, voice low but firm, wasn't broken by me. It broke when people realized silence protects power more than any policy. The room fell into a heavy pause. Across the table, another woman, someone from the Intelligence Oversight Office, flipped through a file. There are sealed records here. Your past affiliations. Special units. Operations that have no formal existence, but nothing explains why you walked away. Alyssa looked at her. You ever try standing in a house that's burning from the inside while everyone else calls the smell integrity? A small breath from the back of the room. Someone sat straighter. Colton set down his pen. We can't run a system on fear of exposure, he said quietly. If everyone starts acting like you, what holds us together? Alyssa folded her hands. Maybe that's the point. Maybe it was never held together the way you thought. The door behind her opened slightly. A staffer slipped in, whispered something to the Ethics Council, then handed her a file. Eleanor opened it. Her face paled. She whispered to Colton, and he leaned over to glance. Then he froze. What is it? The younger analyst asked. Colton's jaw clenched. There's been a leak. Another one? No, Eleanor said slowly. Not like the others. It's a full internal audit report, the one buried 2 years ago. It's online, public, names redacted, but not the footage. Someone from the corner whispered, The Monroe footage? No, Eleanor corrected. All of it. The room buzzed in a low hum of disbelief. Across the country, anonymous files were now surfacing. Use of force reviews, evidence suppression memos, sealed cases. The entire internal oversight archive from the Somerset department had been dumped. Whistleblowers were coming out in coordinated waves. This wasn't her, someone muttered, almost trying to convince themselves. No, Alyssa said, almost to herself. It was never me alone. Outside the building, across streets and states, former victims were speaking up. Videos resurfaced. Anonymous testimonials became verified interviews. A quiet movement that had once only existed in stares and whispers now had momentum. And yet Alyssa remained motionless. Colton stood slowly. We can't operate in chaos. If this continues... Alyssa met his eyes. The chaos isn't new. You're just no longer insulated from it. The tension in the room cracked. Eleanor slowly closed her file. We're going to need time to review implications. Determine next steps. Alyssa nodded. You're free to go. She stood, gathered nothing, she'd brought nothing, and walked toward the door. Before she reached it, the analyst called after her. Wait, she paused. I need to know, he said, voice shaking slightly. Are you trying to tear this down? Alyssa turned, eyes calm. No, he exhaled in relief. I'm just making sure it can't pretend anymore. Then she walked out, the door clicking softly behind her. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of realization, of consequence, of something too large to measure, but impossible to unsee. The city hadn't slept well in weeks. The mood in Somerset was thick, the kind of tense air that made elevators too quiet and greetings at cafes feel like rehearsals. People weren't just watching the news anymore, they were scanning it, waiting for Alyssa Monroe's name to pop up again. But Alyssa didn't appear on screen, not even once. She hadn't spoken publicly since the federal hearing, yet somehow her silence had carved deeper into the public consciousness than any press conference could. Downtown, inside the precinct where Kyle Brenner used to strut through the corridors like he owned the place, the walls now carried a different weight. His desk sat untouched except for the thin layer of dust that had begun to settle over his once polished nameplate. No one asked where he went. No one needed to. The real change, though, wasn't just physical. It was behavioral. Officers no longer leaned back in their chairs bragging about aggressive stops. Training seminars were now filled with more silence than questions. Body cams were no longer seen as threats. They were clutched like lifelines. But all of that tension finally broke one cold Thursday morning when a black SUV pulled up outside the station. The badge on the front grille wasn't local. It wasn't even state. It was federal. Inside the vehicle sat Jordan Laveau, an internal security prosecutor from Washington with a reputation for turning internal memos into indictments. No press, no announcement, just a quiet walk into the building. "Where's Sergeant Mathers?" she asked the front desk. The officer hesitated. "He's out on personal leave." Laveau raised an eyebrow. "Again?" "Yeah, ever since the footage leaked, he's been—" "Spare me," she said, flipping her ID badge back into her coat. "Tell Chief Daniels I'm here." Daniels arrived 5 minutes later, wearing a suit 2 sizes too tight and a smile too wide. "Ms. Laveau, this is unexpected." "No," she replied, "it's overdue." He led her to a side conference room, empty except for a pitcher of water and a stack of unopened reports. "We're cooperating," Daniels said quickly. "We've suspended Kyle Brenner. We're opening sensitivity and ethics retraining. We've begun—" "Stop," he froze. "I'm not here for your rebranding campaign," she said. "I'm here because you have a rot problem. Not surface mold, bone deep." His smile faltered. "You want to know what triggered the DOJ's full review?" she continued, pulling a manila folder from her satchel. "Not just the assault, not the leaked files, but a sworn affidavit." Daniels blinked. "From who?" She opened the folder and laid the paper flat. "From someone in your own building, your records clerk. She claims Kyle Brenner's behavior was known, documented, and protected." He paled. "She named supervisors who ignored complaints, officers who falsified reports, and a memo, your signature, authorizing a procedural bypass after Kyle injured a teenage boy during a stop." Daniel swallowed. "That report was redacted for legal protection." "No, it was erased," Laveau said coldly. "And now it's back." Across town, Alyssa sat in a quiet cafe, her coffee cooling as she watched a mother gently wipe her son's face with a napkin. No one disturbed her. But at the table next to hers, 2 young women whispered, unaware that Alyssa could hear every word. "She's the one, right?" "Yeah, that's her. She didn't even sue." "She didn't want money. She didn't need it. She just stood still and everyone else cracked." Alyssa didn't move. She didn't turn, but she closed her eyes for a moment, just long enough to remind herself that she was still choosing silence, not because it was safe, but because it was strategic. Back at the precinct, Laveau wrapped up the meeting with Daniels and headed toward the exit. Before she reached the door, she paused. "You know," she said without looking back, "when people say the system's broken, they're wrong." Daniels looked confused. "It's not?" "No," she said. "It works exactly the way it was built to. The problem is, it was built without expecting people like her." "Monroe?" "Yes. People who don't need to scream to be heard. People who don't chase punishment but make it inevitable." She walked out without waiting for a response. Later that afternoon, federal agents served warrants at 3 different homes, all belonging to officers under Kyle's command, not for assault, but for obstruction, falsifying reports, and coordinated retaliation against whistleblowers. One of them cried when the cuffs clicked on. Another tried to argue with the agents on his porch, but no one cared. Meanwhile, Kyle Brenner sat alone in a motel room 3 towns over, the TV flickering with headlines he couldn't mute. He hadn't eaten. He barely slept. His world had gone from loud to hauntingly quiet. A knock came at the door. He hesitated. Another knock, slower, firmer. When he opened it, there was no one there, only a small envelope on the ground. He bent down, hands shaking, and opened it. Inside was a photo, not of the incident, not of Alyssa. It was a grainy picture of a young boy, black, about 12, sitting in a hospital bed, face bruised, eyes hollow. On the back, a single line in black ink. He still remembers, even if no one wrote it down. Kyle sat down slowly, the photo trembling in his hands. He couldn't breathe right, couldn't think, because, for the first time, the silence wasn't just outside him, it was inside him too. A silence that made no threats, made no claims, but refused to be escaped. And outside, in a world that was finally watching, the reckoning was no longer coming. It had arrived. The courthouse steps had never felt this still. There were no chants, no flashing cameras, no podiums, just a wide, open silence that wrapped around the marble columns like a verdict waiting to be read. Inside, in courtroom 3B, a hearing was underway, not about assault, not about public disorder, but about a system's accountability. The Department of Justice had filed a full review against the Somerset Police Department. The case was titled United States versus Structural Negligence in Local Enforcement. It was a title that made no headlines but caused every precinct in the state to hold its breath. Alyssa Monroe wasn't in the courtroom. She wasn't called as a witness, wasn't subpoenaed, wasn't part of the official docket. But her presence filled the space like gravity. Every statement, every counter-argument, every exhibit entered into evidence carried the trace of her stillness. She had, without intention, become the measure by which every excuse was now weighed. Up in the gallery, a young law student sat holding a small notepad. On the cover was a printed quote. "He wasn't afraid of being struck back. He was afraid because I didn't need to strike." She didn't know who had originally shared the quote, but she felt it mattered more than any legal doctrine she'd studied. In the center of the courtroom, Sergeant Kyle Brenner was not seated at the defense table. He wasn't even named in the formal inquiry anymore. His name had become shorthand for something larger, an entire culture of intimidation, denial, and quiet complicity. He had resigned quietly the week prior. No farewell message, no press release. His resignation letter was just 2 sentences. "I failed to uphold what I once believed I protected. I now understand the silence was never in others. It was in me." What truly stunned people, however, was not that he resigned. It was what happened next. An anonymous submission appeared in an internal forum for retired officers. It was from Brenner. He wrote, "I once believed authority was earned by how loud you could be. Now I understand the loudest things are often the ones no one dares say aloud." She didn't expose me. She let me see myself. That's the part I'll never escape. Across the country, that message rippled through departments, training centers, and legal education seminars. One high school civics teacher wrote the quote on the board and asked her class, "What's more powerful, law or reflection?" No one answered right away. One student finally stood and said, "Both, if they're honest." And Alyssa. She didn't return to public life. She still taught at the same community center, still took the same route to work, still helped tie the shoes of kids who couldn't yet spell her name. She received offers, speaking tours, book deals, podcasts, even a foundation named after her. She declined them all. But something had shifted. At a small private conference on ethical reform in Chicago, her name came up, not as a case study, but as a question. A sociologist asked, "How do we prepare a society to hear truth when the truth doesn't shout?" The room fell into the kind of silence that doesn't ask for applause, only thought. 1 year later in Somerset, the department's leadership was overhauled. Body cam policies were restructured. A civilian review board was created. The memo, titled Post-Monroe Reforms, was circulated not by activists, but by the city council. No one said her name, but everyone knew who started the ripple. Back at the community center, a little girl named Brielle once asked Alyssa during class, "Miss Alyssa, why do people look at you like they know a secret?" Alyssa smiled, placed a finger gently on her lips, and whispered, "Because sometimes truth doesn't need to be spoken to be heard." The girl didn't fully understand, but she smiled anyway, and that was enough. In a world saturated with noise, Alyssa Monroe reminded people what could happen when someone chooses stillness, not to hide but to reflect back the chaos others tried to ignore. She reminded them that you don't need to command a stage to create change. You just need to make sure silence stops being a shield for injustice and starts becoming a mirror. And that's what makes her unforgettable. If this story moved you, if it stirred something you felt but maybe never put into words, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell us what part stayed with you most. We read every word because your voice matters. This channel exists to bring these moments to light, the moments where truth doesn't shout but echoes. So if you believe in stories that reveal more than they explain, that hold space for justice in the quietest forms, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep building a world where standing still doesn't mean staying silent, where presence becomes power, and where every one of us dares to ask, what kind of silence am I choosing? Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.